In this video, we will talk about word decoding. As you recall, word decoding is going from a visual representation of a word, like this sequence of letters printed on a sheet of paper or shown on screen, to articulating the word that we have recognized. In order to be able to decode words, first of all, one needs to be acquainted with the alphabetic principle. What is the alphabetic principle? As we've said, written language is a visual representation of spoken language elements. So, when the elements are phonemes and the visual symbols are letters, then we have an alphabet. And understanding that letters map onto phonemes is learning the alphabetic principle. In order to be able to do that, first of all, one must have phonological awareness at the level of phonemes. That is, phonemic awareness. You can only learn mappings from letters to phonemes if you are aware of the phonemes in the words. And phonemic awareness is not only a requirement, but also a predictor of reading skill. So how well developed your phonemic awareness is predicts your initial reading development in the early stages of learning to read. Also, you need to know the letters, obviously, and then, of course, their sounds. So learning the letters of the alphabet, their shapes first, and the sounds they map onto is a prerequisite for being able to use the alphabetic principle. And this is also a very strong predictor. Knowledge of the letters of the alphabet and their sounds is a very reliable predictor of progress in learning to read in beginning readers. The combination of phonemic awareness and letter knowledge enables phonological recoding, which is the ability to map sequences of letters to sequences of phonemes working one by one. So this means that you can do this whether or not you know the word that is displayed, because phonological recoding is about working at the phoneme level. You work letter by letter. Graphemes that are composed of multiple letters and other context dependencies are learned later. But what is a pseudoword and why do we care? You see pseudowords discussed a lot in reading textbooks. What is a pseudoword is something like this. Something that looks like a word, that could be a word in your language, but isn't. So this sequence of letters is unknown. You cannot recognize it because it's not a familiar sequence. But you don't have any difficulty reading it aloud or silently. So how do you do that? Well, your ability to read this pseudoword demonstrates the operation of this progression from letters to phonemes and then pronunciation. The fact that you can read pseudowords shows that you are operating on this route here. And this is called phonological recoding. Phonological recoding isn't just for pseudowords. We are using pseudowords to demonstrate that it works because pseudowords can only go this way. But phonological recoding is used for everything, or at least can be used for everything. You can read known words letter by letter. And indeed, beginner readers can only read letter by letter because they haven't learned to recognize all the words yet. What about sight word reading? Let's go back to the definition of written language being a visual representation of spoken language elements. Now, if the elements are whole words, then we can talk about letter strings, which is sequences of letters, and phoneme strings, which is sequences of phonemes. So sight word reading is the ability to go from from familiar sequences of letters to known or familiar sequences of phonemes. That is, words that you already know in your spoken language. For this to work, you must have the words stored in your memory. Not only the spoken words, of course, but also the written words. This means that the letter strings or the sequences of letters that form familiar words have been encountered multiple times. You have read them before several times. Every time you read a word, a trace of its form is stored in your memory. If you read it enough times, this stored form becomes sufficiently strong that you can actually find it. So you can access and recognize strings or letter sequences that are stored in your memory. And when you can do that quickly and without effort, then you achieve what is called rapid orthographic decoding. So orthographic decoding, which is only possible for known sequences of letters, is the mapping from a known sequence of letters that you recognize to the way this whole sequence is pronounced. So going from a recognized word as it is written to the way this word is pronounced in your spoken language that you know. Let's look at some special real words in Norwegian. What is special about these words? You have probably guessed that they are a little strange because if you read them letter by letter, you will read them incorrectly. So in the first one, this letter is actually pronounced E. And in the second one, this letter is not pronounced at all. In these two, the middle letter is not pronounced the same way. So how can you read these words? You didn't have any trouble. Immediately as you saw them, you could read them aloud correctly without even thinking. This is because you have stored these letter sequences and their mapping to how they're pronounced, to their corresponding phonological words that you already know. So you recognize these letter sequences. You recognize this sequence. You recognize this sequence, and so on. And that lets you pronounce it correctly. So this demonstrates the operation of this connection, going from a recognized letter sequence to how this word is actually supposed to be pronounced, even when it violates the rules of pronunciation letter by letter. So if you were going this way, you would mispronounce it, but this doesn't ever happen because you know how to read in Norwegian and you have encountered these words many times. Going this way is called sight word reading or orthographic decoding. And again, using these irregular words doesn't mean that we use this connection only for irregular words. This connection is used for every familiar word. The reason we used these strange words in the example is because these words cannot be read by mapping letters to phonemes. And so they just demonstrate that this connection works. The orthographic decoding connection exists and works. As you've probably noticed, both ways of reading or decoding a word involve mapping onto phonological elements, either going to phonemes and then blending, or going to the entire phonological word form. In both cases, the written language went through an oral language representation before anything else could happen. Well, in this case, it was just to pronounce it. But if you're reading silently, the idea is that phonology always mediates. So you activate how words sound in your mind as you read and recognize words that you know. So mediation is that phonology is a part of the mental chain in your skilled reading. And it has, as we showed, two different connections. The first way to read with phonological mediation is called assembled phonology. So you assemble the phonological representation of a word. It's also called the indirect route because it involves going through the parts. And it's also called phonological recoding. And it involves recognizing the individual letters, mapping the letters onto their corresponding phonemes, and then blending these phonemes to the word they mean, and then you can either pronounce it or access its meaning or both. The second way in which phonological mediation works is via the connection of entire words. That is called addressed phonology because you address the phonological representation of a word. It's also called the direct route because you're going directly from one entire word to the same entire word in phonology. And it's also called orthographic decoding. And that just involves going directly from a letter sequence to a phoneme sequence. Now, when I say directly, I don't mean you don't have to recognize the letters. You definitely have to recognize the letters. The direct route is not about word shapes. You may see sometimes talk about word shapes, but reading research has conclusively demonstrated that you do not recognize words by their shape. Readers recognize words by recognizing the letters that are in the word. So you have to go through letter identities. The difference is that this whole sequence is known and directly connected to the word's phonological form. Okay, so here we have two different ways of phonological mediation, two ways of decoding, one via letters to phonemes and one via whole word representations. Is that the whole story? Well, actually not. There are some complications. It is very common in the literature to see binary distinctions like that. So see things split in two ways. And some people seem to take it very literally, meaning that there is only two ways, not more. And some people also think that these two ways are fundamentally different in how they work, in the processes involved. Note, we haven't said anything about the processes here. I've only been talking about the difference of the units which are mapped. So in one case, letters are mapped onto phonemes, and in the other case, whole words are mapped onto whole words, orthographic to phonological forms. Now, this does not imply that the mappings are done in a different way. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but we've only been talking about two units of different sizes so far. Thinking about decoding as being just two possibilities, and indeed two very different possibilities, is very certainly an oversimplification. One reason that it has to be oversimplification is that we know that pseudo-word reading efficiency, so how efficiently one reads words that don't exist, new words they've never seen before, this actually grows in conjunction with word reading efficiency, with how easily and quickly one reads words one already knows. This suggests that the two kinds of connections do not operate on fundamentally different ways. They're probably not two different kinds of reading, although they concern different sizes of units that are mapped. The second, and probably more obvious, is that there is a bunch of stuff between single letters and whole words that we haven't considered. The most obvious of these is the notion of the grapheme. And indeed, everyone agrees that graphemes are extremely important units in learning to read via the assembled phonology. What are graphemes? A grapheme is something that corresponds to one phoneme. So sometimes it's a single letter, and that's called a simple grapheme, like this letter corresponding to this phoneme. But there are also multi-letter graphemes. So in Norwegian, this combination and this combination map onto this phoneme. So these are multi-letter graphemes. There are also context-dependent graphemes. For example, this letter, when followed by this one, is actually pronounced h, not k. So the context in which this letter, this grapheme, finds itself determines how it will be pronounced. Note that this is not a multi-letter grapheme because this letter is then pronounced. So that's a different grapheme. But this one depends on this one for determining how it will be pronounced correctly. Norwegian vowels are context-dependent graphemes because whether they are short or long depends on the number of consonants following them. So this letter followed by one consonant is pronounced short, but followed by two consonants is pronounced long. And of course, there are exceptions where people must know the whole word, but that is not assembled phonology. That would be addressed phonology, so that doesn't belong here. The consistency of mappings between graphemes and phonemes is called orthographic transparency. So a grapheme that always corresponds to the same phoneme is consistent. A grapheme that can map to multiple phonemes is inconsistent, and vice versa. A phoneme that's always spelled the same way is consistent. A phoneme that can be spelled multiple ways is inconsistent. A writing system that has a lot of inconsistent mappings like that would be a writing system with low orthographic transparency. In contrast, a writing system in which most mappings are consistent, so phonemes tend to be mapped to the same graphemes and vice versa, that would be a transparent or relatively transparent orthographic system. So in the alphabetic languages of Europe, English has a non-transparent writing system, so has low orthographic transparency, whereas Finnish has very high orthographic transparency because every phoneme is spelled with one letter, always the same one. Norwegian is somewhere in between these two, closer to transparent than to non-transparent, and certainly more transparent than the neighboring Danish, which is much less consistent. But graphemes do not exhaust the possibilities. There are also larger chunks. Larger chunks means letter strings that are larger than graphemes. Therefore, they map onto more than one phoneme. Remember, the definition of a grapheme is a letter or combination of letters that maps onto one phoneme. So any chunk that is larger than one grapheme must map onto two or more phonemes. And when you read and you have read a lot and you have become a skilled reader, that means that you have encountered common letter sequences very many times. And you have pronounced those very many times. And to the extent those are consistent, you have learned the mappings between the larger letter sequences and their corresponding pronunciations. Why? Because every time you do something, your brain stores a trace of it. So when you've done something many times, you've learned it. So the same way that you learn whole words, you also learn word parts, whether you like it or not, just because you've done it many times. So it's pretty clear that a skilled reader's mind contains the mappings from the orthographic representation of letter sequences larger than a grapheme to their corresponding phonological forms, to their corresponding pronunciation. And this can be any letter combination that occurs frequently, that you've read many times. It may correspond to a linguistic unit, like a syllable or a morpheme, which is a word part that has some meaning or that modifies a word's meaning, like the suffix else in Norwegian. Or it can be any arbitrary chunk, any letter sequence that has been frequently encountered. And there are lots and lots of them because the written languages are very systematic in using frequently occurring sequences of letters to represent their phonological forms. So you've learned a whole bunch of larger chunks. And this is what allows you to read new words, whether they exist or whether they're pseudo words, rapidly if you're a skilled reader. It's because you've become familiar with word parts and don't really need to go letter by letter or grapheme by grapheme when you're a skilled reader in order to read a new or a non-existent word. Let us turn to the third complication, which has to do with context. When we say context here, we mean other words. So the context of one word being other words, the words before and after it in a sentence. So that's called a supralexical level or interlexical. So this means above a word, and this means between words. And this is in contrast to the context of a grapheme, which is other graphemes, or the context of a chunk, which is other chunks. So we're talking about word context here. We're talking about other words. And this involves meaning. So it requires access to semantic information, to your knowledge of meanings in your mind. And it may depend on lexical or syntactic use. This means it may depend on which words there are or in the relative positions of different kinds of words. Just look at these three pairs of words. Is it 3 words or is it 6 words? Well, you usually wouldn't see it like that. If you were looking at these phrases, you wouldn't have any trouble pronouncing them correctly without thinking about them at all. However, these words are not pronounced in the same way. So depending on what is around, the pronunciation of these critical words changes. Actually, their identity changes, not just how they're pronounced, but also what they mean. So when you see this word, then you know how this one should be interpreted and pronounced. When you see this phrase, you know how this word should be interpreted and pronounced. When you see this sequence here, you know what's coming. This needs to be a verb. When you see this sequence, this needs to be a noun. So it's pronounced differently. It's another word. So these are actually 6 different words. But how do you read them? How do you pronounce them properly and access the correct meaning when you see them? Well, you can't if they're alone. It's not possible. You could choose one arbitrarily, but it could be the other one. And this distinction cannot come from recognition of the orthographic form because the orthographic forms are identical. So this and this are basically the same thing. But here they're not the same thing. So this means that when you're reading this word, you're basing your reading on the meanings around it or on the words around it. So this means that we're going to have to extend our diagram in several ways. The first way to extend our diagram is to include the notion of a grapheme. So graphemes is what actually maps onto phonemes, not individual letters. It can be individual letters or combination of letters or letters in context. So assembled phonology fundamentally includes graphemes. Also, you learn larger letter chunks and their pronunciation by being an experienced reader, by having encountered these frequently. So this is also a kind of intermediate assembled phonology. It's not exactly addressed because it's not whole words, but it's also not just graphemes, so it's somewhere in a limbo between there. And the third thing is the fact that context must play a role and does play a role and does help you read words fluently without stopping to think means that word meanings can influence your choice of word to say, and that orthographic word forms can be aided in their recognition by knowledge of what the sentence is about. So we've added a bunch of arrows there to indicate additional connections that must exist in this developing reading system, which is grafting itself onto this spoken language system. And once you become a skilled reader, then what you've actually formed after all your multiple encounters with words across diverse contexts, what you have formed is a set of tightly connected representations of orthographic word forms, which is the word you've seen many times and read many times, phonological word forms, which is the spoken words in your language that you know, and their meanings. And these are all connected because they get connected and strengthened every time you encounter them. And so every triplet like this is a word you know, is a representation of a word in your mental lexicon. Lexicon means dictionary. So this is the dictionary of your mind in which words are represented by these three parts. And a skilled reader who has these, and a skilled reader who has a well-developed mental lexicon can then use this mental lexicon in order to read and write, perceive and produce speech, and understand text, whether that is read or spoken.